Hello, everyone. I'm Shahzeb Usman, and we welcome you to our conversation. Today, we will be discussing some of the issues within international refugee law and migration policies. We are joined by Diana Volpe. Diana Volpe is a political scientist and a PhD candidate at University of Oxford. She's specializing in international development. Diana also holds a BA in Politics and International Relations from University College Dublin and an MSc in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies from the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on the ethics of outsourcing of migration control operations in the Mediterranean Sea and the legitimation processes of certain policies of cooperation between Italy and Libya within the Italian political sphere. She's also the managing editor of the Border Criminologies blog, a trustee of the People and Planet charity organization, and an activist and founder of the Oxford based chapter of the campaign Divest Borders. Hello, Diana. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you, Shabit. How are you?
I'm well too. My first question is about the role of international refugee law. So, as a political scientist, how do you view the role of international refugee law in preserving the interests of economic migrants from developing countries who migrate primarily due to the poverty created, by the Western economic neoliberalism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a couple things going on here. Well, when we talk about refugees, obviously, that is a separate entity legally from what is usually called a migrant or an economic migrant. I'm not sure whether economic migrant is a specified legal definition, but it's definitely a political definition that is used a lot, especially in um, a lot of Western countries, if we want to use the Western word. Um, I think perhaps, I mean, international refugee law is not there specifically for those, right? For economic migrants. But it's a very difficult distinction to draw, I think, as time passes and as climate change especially becomes um, more and more present in as a reason for mobility in the world. And it is, I think, going to play an ever more important role because of that reason, because the line between economic migrant and refugee is blurred at best, especially in situations of really abject poverty, as a very often for reasons that are very strongly interrelated with the colonial past of a certain country. And um, climate refugees are not a legal definition, right? Because of the history and when the Geneva Convention was drafted, it was just not something that was in the minds of the drafters at the time. So it is probable that a lot of these definitions are going to be less and less relevant as time comes forward and as people move forward because of the reasons why people move. They are not really the same as they were when the Refugee Convention was drafted, and the world looks very different, that very, very different, and the reasons behind the legal definition as it was have changed a lot. So, for example, if you see other geographical agreements that are not the Geneva Convention, like the African Union's protocol has a much larger definition of what a refugee is, which does include for generalized violence, for example, which is something that the Geneva Convention does not account for. And I can only imagine that cases of abject poverty will in the future become more and more of an important reason. Now, when I say abject poverty, obviously, I'm not talking about everyone, right? It's a very specific type of like what they call survival migration. But people that do move for economic reasons, um, I personally don't think should fit or be taken under international refugee law because economic migration is just right. It's in a way regular migration, and it's a type of migration that, for example, I have done, and I had every right to do. And I think people everywhere in the world should have the right to do and should have legal channels to do if they want to move. Now, some people, obviously, some countries and some past relations, I think, give people from developing countries even more of a ethical claim to them than people within developed countries currently do. But that is not how the world order currently allows for it. But it should. So I don't know if that answered your question. I feel like I went about it a bit of a roundabout way.
No, I totally agree with you. I think, the idea is that the Western powers have created this poverty in developing countries, first through colonization, and now, this export of economic neoliberalism through, IMF structural adjustment programs. And we have seen that the premium on capital has increased due to these economic liberalization reforms, and premium on wage has decreased. So there's rising inequality in the developing countries, and that prompts these kind of irregular migration in the form of economic needs. And the message from the Western power is very clear that if you have the social economic capital, you are welcomed. If you have the skills to support Western market, you are welcomed. If you have enough money to invest, you are welcomed. But if you don't have any of that, you can drown in sea, as we have seen in the recent very tragic boat accident. So my second question is also somewhat related to it. Do you find the international refugee law inherently a reflection of state interests and positivist in conception, which in turn reflects the current racial nature of world order? Because we have seen that most of the international lawyers that I know say that refugee law or international law is positivist in nature. It just reflects state interests. And if the definition of refugee says that economic migrants are not within it, it is just like that. So do you find this idea plausible?
Now, obviously, I'm not a lawyer, so I'll start from, I guess, my more like political point of view. When you sent me this question, the first thing that popped to my head was this article that was published a couple of years ago by Ulrike Krause, called "Colonial Roots of the 1951 Refugee Convention and its Effect on the Global Refugee Regime." And in this article, she goes through archival research of the debates that were going through state delegations during the founding conference of the convention, so around July 1951. Unsurprisingly, what the article goes to uncover is the fact that colonial and imperial states pretty much dominated the debate, right? While colonized countries were excluded and silenced in what she calls the convention's founding to be colonial ignorant. Now, as I'm sure you know, like the original convention was limited in geography and in time, and then was expanded furthermore.
Yeah.
But I think it's really telling that the original convention was limited to Europe, because what it had in mind was what some people in academic debates consider to be like refugee taking as a quite political act, right? Like you do it not because it's an unusual act, but it's because you're also in turn condemning the actions of another state that produces refugees. So I do think that that's something that needs to be taken into account. The history of the creation of international refugee law pretty much has to do with the fact that it was during Cold War times. And there was a very strong will to condemn between the blocs. And that I think also reflects in the wording of the Refugee Convention itself, like the very strong focus on persecution. Individual persecution is not accidental, right? Like it's considered in the context of totalitarian regimes and targeted persecution. That's not how a lot of refugees are understood today. A lot of refugees now come from war, from generalized violence. That's not obviously individualized persecution, but it's much more just running away for your life.
Yeah.
And the fact that that sometimes is important in in status determination and sometimes is not, I think really does reflect the current racial nature of the world order, because people fleeing war from Syria or from Ukraine are not technically conventional refugees. They're fleeing generalized violence, they're fleeing war. But people doing the same thing in other places of the world, like South Sudan, are not really always given the same blanket status. So it really does, I think, reflect state interests in nation building and in understanding who is part and welcome within a state and who is. Now, does that reflect? I do think that reflects both in the way that the convention was originally drafted and also in the way that the convention is now applied, which is at best incredibly uneven, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. I think the international refugee law has a racial nature in it, and we see it, systematically in various provisions, especially in the context in which it was drafted. My third question relates to your PhD, actually, and it also relates with the law, but also comes with the political angle of it. So my question is, how do you view the systematic evasion of international refugee law through the delegation of maritime operations and to maritime operation to third parties and to the states, and creating these reception centers we have seen, for example, in Libya and everything. So how do you see this systematic evasion of international refugee law by states such as, for example, Italy?
How do I see it? I see it as evading the international law and certainly the spirit of international law and the spirit of international refugee law, because what countries are doing, I think countries like Italy, but obviously backed by the European Union. And it's not actually something that only Italy does. Like, this is much older than countries like Australia have been doing with Nauru and with Indonesia for the longest time with migration coming from Southeast Asia. But it's a race to the bottom. I think that they're just looking for legal loopholes to not do what they signed international agreements to do. Now, obviously, if we look, for example, at the case that I'm studying, which, as you mentioned, is reception centers. So detention centers, very much concentration camps in Libya. It doesn't only, it's not only trying to avoid international refugee law. It's avoiding international customary law. It's avoiding international human rights law. There is very much documented cases of torture and abuse and slavery and extrajudicial executions in these places that people have known for at least 10, 15 years, but it doesn't stop anyone from doing it because of international interest, right? The Italian national interest is that we don't want migrants coming in. And the word migrants is not used accidentally, and everything else just becomes an accident of it. But it's the nature of the international system and the fact that you don't really have an overarching authority that can tell people to not do these things is telling. So the only time in which things kind of changed, at least in the Italian case, is when the European Court of Human Rights ruled against what Italy was originally doing, which was doing search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean international waters, putting them on Italian Navy vessels and then bringing them back to Libya. Now, obviously, in the Hirsi case, the European Court of Human Rights told them that once they reach an Italian military vessel, they end up under Italian jurisdiction and therefore should be able to claim asylum. So in order to avoid that, Italy started creating a fictitious coast guard on the other side. And that is entirely just to avoid the jurisdictional link that would bring them back to Italy. But these are literally using Italian vessels. They are trained by Italian coast guards. They are financed by the European EU Fund for Africa, which really, it just really tells, especially about what we were saying earlier about the current racial nature of the world order, right? In a country that has no real rule of law and has been in civil war for almost 10 years now, also very much because of decades, if not centuries, of foreign intervention. So it's a very complicated context, but the way I view it is, yeah, pretty much just skirting international obligations and a race to the bottom to what little they can do, which is actually, on the other hand, quite a lot, because there is a lot of involvement in trying to stop people coming. So if only they actually just repurposed that money and effort into other ways, like legal channels, it would end up causing a lot less harm and a lot less taxpayers' money going towards.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think as a person who's interested in international law, I can tell you that this kind of evasion tactics are against the object and purpose of the treaty. This is systematic bypassing, systematic evasion of the spirit of the treaty. I think it is against the principle of non-refoulement. So it takes me to the next question. And as a European, how do you think that the European public consider as legitimate forms of migration control? Because we have seen that a lot of politics have been coming from the public sentiment, and the public sentiment has a role in shaping these kind of migration controls. So how do you view the role of European public in shaping these kind of policies?
So this is also the crux of my PhD research.
Yeah.
So as you know, it is not something I have a full answer to, because it's what I am personally trying to figure out. But I think something that is very worth noting is that public sentiments are not don't happen in a vacuum, right? So the reason why public sentiments might be quite negative in a country like Italy is also because of decades of xenophobic propaganda that has led people to feeling a certain way, or channeling socioeconomic frustrations towards an other that has been othered through a very systematic process of nation building and identity creation. I think something that was inevitable was when a semi-federal organization like the European Union came about. I think it's really hard to separate state discourses and state discourses from public opinion, because these often are in a circle with each other and in a conversation with each other in a way that is very difficult to discern. Because obviously, if there is socioeconomic issues within a population, like a country like Italy within the European Union has had quite stagnant salaries, for example, and a quite strong geographical divide, and it's really easy for a right-wing party to use that for their advantage, right? Just say, like, this has nothing to do with bad administration of the government. It has everything to do with this specific minority in the population that is taking all of your jobs. That is why you're unhappy. And at the start, it feels quite a stark thing to hear. But then after years and years and years, like now the so-called youth refugee crisis of 2014, 2015 is almost 10 years ago. It has obviously bred into a system in which right-wing unwillingness to support people that came in meant that these people were very often kind of brought into, organized crime, which is not what happens every time. But it's definitely a circle that, especially in the south of Italy, like what they call like informal networks of markets, and especially like a big one that kept popping up in my interviews was tomato picking. It just means that both on an economic analysis level and on a political level, it creates a minority that is easy to blame socioeconomic issues in. That becomes something that parties can also keep harnessing on. So it becomes a vicious cycle that is really hard to break when there's no real alternatives proposed by people that don't actually have negative opinions or views of mobility and migration as a whole, which was something that in my fieldwork research so far, I did find to be a quite large group of the population. Like most people don't have very strong negative opinion against these kinds of migration. They just don't really know what the alternative is at this point. It's once again very complicated thing, but I think that state discourses definitely have an effect on public opinion more than the other way around.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think politicization of refugee crisis is really, really sad. And I also think that, for example, we have seen that various states have used the refugee crisis as a bargaining chip to get some certain kinds of, trade concessions or whatever they want from that particular crisis. So do you think that the refugee crisis has the potential to be politicized between states?
Oh, absolutely. I think it happens all the time. It has happened all the time in history and it's still happening today. I think especially bordering countries that host a lot of refugees use it as a bargaining chip against richer countries that are, so-called like reception countries or destination countries all the time. If you think about, I mean, Italy, Libya, for example, something that I've always found stark is that before the so-called refugee crisis, in 2008, Gaddafi and Berlusconi actually signed an agreement called the Friendship Treaty, which on paper was to pay reparations for colonial times, which is unheard of any other colonial empire. Like I don't think any other country, any other European country has agreed formally to pay reparations. And the reason for that was that it was a bargaining chip, right? To hold migrants on the other side of the Mediterranean. And while in Libya, I think it was quite a big event. They changed the name of a day, Friendship Day, like to remember it. In Italy, like no one knows that we technically agreed to pay reparations. It was just kind of seen as a development agreement to help migration control cooperation. And that's just an example. Like the European Union pays a lot of money to Turkey. And when Turkey wants more, they very much just open the gate, right? Or at least threaten it and to reopen the Balkan route. It's something that happens in a lot of places, all the time. And it's very sad because it does give leverage to developing countries in a way that they usually don't have against countries that have already done a lot of harm to them. But it is a very sad way to do it, unfortunately, because there's people, right? You're using people as a bargaining chip, people that already.
Yeah, that is really, really sad, I think. My next question relates to the concept of human smuggling, because human smugglers have exploited this situation, the misery of people, to utmost. Like they have used it like in the most bad way possible. So do you think that, for example, states have any kind of leverage in controlling human smuggling? And what are the moral or legal ways to stop human smuggling? Do you think states have the capacity to stop this very, very bad thing?
I think in international discourse, the word smuggler and the word trafficker have blurred a bit, but they are actually quite different things. And I don't know that smuggling can be obviously quite exploitative of people seeking refuge, but it's not always like that. There's actually quite a few very interesting researches looking at relationships between like smugglers helping people through the desert or through like different things. It's just that anything could be smuggling, right? If I have a very dear friend who's trying to seek refuge in France and I help them cross the border in my car, I'm a smuggler. But obviously that's not comparable to people who put 400 people on a dinghy that can handle 30 and just throw them to their death throughout the Mediterranean. But I think that, well, to answer this question, what can state do in a legitimate moral way to stop human smuggling is offer safe and legal channels to come to the country. That is the
Yeah.
one thing,
Yeah.
that is the reason why smuggling exists. If there were legal ways, if there were safe ways for people to cross or to come, smuggling wouldn't have a reason to exist. And it doesn't have a reason to exist. The only reason it exists is because of barriers that exist for some passports and not others. And it's the reason why it changes through time, right? Like the routes they use and the reason why they exist. It's just because if there were legal ways for people to move whatever they wanted to move, then smuggling wouldn't exist. I think that is the most legitimate and moral way of states to do it. Just stop creating fortresses and militarized borders.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that matter. I think smuggling is something which will always happen if there is some kind of problem. And I think states should just create, legal open channels for people to come rather than, curbing the flow of migration altogether, because I think it will be counterproductive. My last question relates to international human rights law. And we have seen that international human rights law is quite fluid and it comes almost in every sphere. So, do you think that human rights law has a role in protecting refugees at all stages of their journey? Because I think this language of human rights law, this jargon of human rights law, is quite accepted worldwide. We can disagree with it, but generally it is the jargon that is generally used in the world. So, do you think that we have any kind of potential through international human rights law to create some kind of protections for the refugees?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it already does. I think not every country is a signatory to the Refugee Convention, but there is a certain amount of customary law, most often through human rights law, that still binds people, right? One of these examples is non-refoulement. Even if a country is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, they can't legally return someone to a place where they would face persecution. And that is something that has very much come from this. A lot of other examples, obviously, especially considering what happens very often in the stages of migration of people across. It does, like, refugees don't always have a passport. They don't always have all the rights that a passport bearing person has, but they should, like, they do, because of international human rights law. Still have every right that every human being should have. And now, do they always manage to protect them in the ways that they have the rights to? I don't think so, unfortunately. I think that's just the problem with international law in general, right? It's it lacks that binding, overarching that forces states to behave. I do definitely think that it's a very important part of refugee rights, and which is why, like, as a not lawyer, we study them together, right? When the of international law that I did very much included international human rights law, because it's at the very basis of the Refugee Convention as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you mentioned the principle of non-refoulement. We have seen that in the Convention Against Torture, there is also a mention of it. So even if a state is not adhering to international refugee law, a lot of protections can come through international human rights law, which is generally far more accepted. So I do find some potential for refugee protection through international human rights law. I think I'm convinced that there is a certain leeway within it for the refugees. Thank you so much, Diana, for coming to our podcast. I, as a student of international refugee law and migration policies, learned a lot in this podcast and enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.